The colonel's voice cut across the parade ground like artillery fire. "Get this vagrant out of here before the general arrives." The old man in the threadbare jacket did not move. His hands, spotted with age and scarred across the knuckles, remained still at his sides. Pinned to his chest were medals so faded they looked like toys from a dollar store, tarnished beyond recognition, arranged in a row that seemed almost deliberate despite their worn condition. But what the colonel did not know, what no one standing in that crisp November formation knew, was that in exactly 20 minutes, a 4-star general would cross this parade ground, see those medals, and end the colonel's career with 6 words. Colonel Bradford Sterling straightened his academy ring and strode toward the old man with the theatrical confidence of someone who had never been told no. The parade ground of Holloway Military Academy stretched behind him, manicured grass bordered by Georgian brick buildings that had produced generals and senators for nearly 2 centuries. Today was Veterans Day. Today, important people would be watching. And today, Colonel Sterling would not allow some homeless vagrant to contaminate his perfect ceremony. "You there," Sterling called out, his voice pitched to carry across the formation of cadets who stood at parade rest, waiting for the distinguished visitor to arrive. "What do you think you are?" The old man turned slowly. His eyes, watery blue and seemingly unfocused, found the colonel's face. He stood perhaps 5'10", though his shoulders curved forward with age, making him appear smaller. His jacket, olive green and 2 sizes too large, hung from his gaunt frame like a borrowed shroud. A single button held it closed against the November chill. "I asked you a question," Sterling continued, closing the distance between them. "This is a military academy. This is a ceremony honoring Real veterans. And you are trespassing." The old man's voice came out soft, slightly hoarse, as if he had not spoken to anyone in days. "I served, sir. I just came to see the wall." Sterling's laugh was sharp and performative, designed to be heard by the cadets, now turning their heads despite their orders to remain at attention. "The wall. Of course you did. And those medals on your chest, I suppose you earned those too?" "Yes, sir." Sterling stepped closer, examining the faded ribbons and tarnished metal with exaggerated scrutiny. His fingers actually reached out and flicked one of them, a gesture so dismissive that several cadets flinched. "This is supposed to be a silver star? The clasp is completely wrong. And this ribbon here, it is in the wrong order entirely. Where did you buy these? Some surplus store off the highway?" The old man did not respond. His hands remained at his sides, still and scarred, and something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His spine straightened by perhaps half an inch, his chin lifted by a degree. It was the kind of adjustment that meant nothing to civilians, but everything to anyone who had ever stood at attention. Sergeant Major Vincent Rowe noticed it from 30 feet away. He had been supervising the cadet formation when the commotion began, and now he watched with growing unease as his commanding officer publicly humiliated an elderly man. Something about the vagrant tugged at a memory Rowe could not quite place. The way he held himself, the economy of his movements. The fact that despite the colonel's escalating mockery, the old man showed no anger, no defensiveness, no shame. Only a quiet, almost unsettling stillness. If you are watching from anywhere in the world today, know that stories like this won't happen in communities everywhere. You might have a quiet hero in your own neighborhood whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Sterling snapped his fingers at a pair of military police officers who had been stationed near the memorial entrance. "You two, get over here. We have a stolen valor situation." The MPs approached with the careful hesitation of men who sensed they were walking into something more complicated than their commanding officer realized. One of them, a staff sergeant with Afghanistan ribbons on his own chest, studied the old man's face as he approached. Something flickered in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but uncertainty. "Sir," the staff sergeant said to Sterling, "maybe we should just escort him out quietly. The general will be here in 15 minutes, and I am aware of the timeline. Sergeant, that is precisely why I want this handled now." Sterling's voice rose another notch, ensuring every cadet within 50 meters could hear his decisive leadership. I want him photographed. I want his information taken. And I want him off this property before General Webb's motorcade arrives. The old man spoke again, still soft, still respectful. Sir, I do not want any trouble. I just came to see my son's name. On the memorial wall. If you'll give me 5 minutes, I will leave on my own. Sterling's eyes narrowed. Your son? Yes, sir. He graduated from this academy. Class of 2004. Something almost like hesitation crossed Sterling's face, but it vanished quickly, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who saw complications rather than human beings. And where's your son now? The old man's voice did not waver, but something behind his eyes seemed to collapse inward, like a building falling into its own foundation. Kandahar, sir. 2008. The parade ground fell silent. Even the November wind seemed to pause. Several cadets exchanged glances, their rigid postures softening slightly with discomfort. But Colonel Sterling had committed to his course of action, and admitting error in front of subordinates was not something Bradford Sterling did. That is very convenient, Sterling said, his voice hardening rather than softening. A dead son. A sympathetic story. I have heard it all before from men like you. Men who prey on real veterans, real sacrifice, real. His hand shot out and grabbed the old man's forearm, intending to spin him toward the waiting MPs. And in that moment, as the threadbare sleeve rode up 3 inches above a weathered wrist, Sergeant Major Rowe saw it. The tattoo. Faded green ink on sun-damaged skin. Coordinates. A date. And below them, a number that made his blood turn to ice. 47. Rowe's father had spoken of only one man who carried that number. One man who had led a team into a place that did not officially exist and brought out 47 prisoners of war. One man whose call sign was whispered with reverence in every Special Forces unit from Fort Bragg to Vietnam. And if this was that man, if this broken old vagrant in the threadbare jacket was who Rowe thought he was, then Colonel Bradford Sterling had just made the worst mistake of his career. The colonel's hand was still wrapped around the old man's arm when the black sedan with 4-star flags on its bumper pulled through the academy gates. The sedan rolled to a stop near the reviewing stand, but Elias Thorne did not see it. His eyes had drifted back to the memorial wall, that long curve of granite where names were carved in rows so neat they looked like soldiers standing in formation. Third panel. Second row. The letters he had traced so many times in his mind that he could feel them beneath his fingertips even from 50 feet away. Captain David Thorne. Kia, Afghanistan. 2008. Class of 2004. 4 years ago, Elias had stood on this same parade ground in a suit that still fit him then, with Margaret beside him in her blue dress, the one that matched her eyes. David had marched with his class across this grass, shoulders squared, jaw set with the quiet confidence of a young man who believed he could change the world. Margaret had gripped Elias's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, and she had whispered through her tears, "We did good, Eli. Look at him. We did so good." She was already sick then, though neither of them knew it. The cough she blamed on allergies. The weight she said she was losing on purpose. The fatigue she hid behind extra cups of coffee and 4 smiles. 6 months after David's graduation, the diagnosis came. 18 months after that, she was gone. Elias remembered the funeral with a clarity that felt like punishment. The flag on her casket because she had served too, a Navy nurse who met a young Special Forces sergeant in a field hospital and fell in love with his quiet intensity and scarred hands. David had stood beside him at the graveside, tall in his dress uniform, his arm around his father's shoulders. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. They were Thorne men. They carried their grief like rucksacks, invisible to the world, but heavy enough to bow their spines. "I will come home, Dad," David had said the last time they spoke, 3 days before the convoy. "I promise. We will figure this out together. You should not be alone in that house." But David did not come home, and Elias did not stay in that house. The walls held too many ghosts. Margaret's perfume lingering in the closets. David's high school trophies gathering dust. The photographs that stared at him from every surface, asking why he was still breathing when they were not. The colonel's grip tightened on his forearm, yanking Elias back to the present. I asked you a question. Are you going to answer me, or just stand there like a mute? Elias blinked. The memorial wall swam back into focus. The cadets in their formations. The November sky, gray and heavy with the promise of rain. And this man, this colonel with his polished brass and academy ring, who looked at Elias and saw nothing worth respecting. I apologize, sir, Elias said. My mind wandered. Your mind wandered. Sterling's laugh was a bark of contempt. Unbelievable. You wander onto my academy, wearing medals you bought at a flea market, and now you cannot even focus long enough to answer simple questions. Sergeant Major Rowe had moved closer, his eyes fixed on the tattoo that was still visible above the colonel's grip. The coordinates, the date, the number 47 inked in faded green beneath them. His father had described that tattoo in detail so many times that Rowe could have drawn it from memory. The latitude and longitude of a camp in Laos that appeared on no official maps. The date of the extraction that never officially happened. And the number of American prisoners who came home because of one man. Colonel, Rowe said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Perhaps we should wait until after the ceremony to address this situation. Sterling did not even look at him. I did not ask for your opinion, Sergeant Major. I am handling this. With respect, sir, there may be more to this than... More to what? Sterling released Elias's arm with a small shove that made the old man stumble half a step. More to some vagrant in a costume? Look at him, Rowe. Look at those medals. You think this man earned a silver star? You think he earned any of these? Rowe looked. He looked at the threadbare jacket 2 sizes too large. The faded ribbons arranged with the precision of someone who knew exactly how they were supposed to sit. The Medal of Honor, tarnished almost beyond recognition, but hanging exactly where it should hang on a chest that had carried it for 5 decades. And he looked at the old man's hands, scarred across the knuckles in patterns that came from decades of weapons handling, from rope burns and knife work, and the kind of close combat that left marks no amount of time could erase. Sir, Rowe said slowly, I think we should be very careful here. The only thing I need to be careful about is making sure this ceremony goes perfectly. Sterling straightened his jacket and gestured sharply to the MPs. Photograph him for the Stolen Valor Registry. Get his information, and get him off my parade ground before the general finishes glad-handing his way over here. The staff sergeant MP hesitated, his hand hovering near his phone camera. Something in the old man's bearing had unsettled him. The way he stood, even now, even after being grabbed and shoved and publicly humiliated. There was no anger in his posture, no self-pity, no shame, just a stillness that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, somewhere that civilian life did not reach. Sir, the staff sergeant said to Elias, not to Sterling, can you state your name and service branch for the record? Elias lifted his chin slightly. The movement was automatic, muscle memory from a life lived in uniform. Elias James Thorne, Master Sergeant, 5th Special Forces Group. Retired. Sterling snorted. Special Forces. Of course. They always claim Special Forces because they think it cannot be verified. He turned to address the gathered cadets, his voice rising to lecture volume. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Stolen valor is a crime. It disrespects every man and woman who actually served. And men like this, he jabbed a finger toward Elias. They are parasites feeding on the honor of real soldiers. Elias said nothing. His eyes had found the memorial wall again, found the third panel, found the name he had come to touch. David had walked across this grass in triumph. David had stood where these cadets stood and dreamed of the future. David had believed in honor and service and sacrifice, and David had died for those beliefs in a valley on the other side of the world. And now Elias stood on the same ground, being called a parasite by a man who had never heard a shot fired in anger, while his son's name was carved in a stone 50 feet away. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. He simply stood, hands at his sides, weathered face impassive, and let the colonel's words wash over him like rain. Because defending himself had never been something Elias Thorne did. The 47 men he had carried out of that jungle knew what he was. The families who sent him letters every Christmas knew. The generals who had pinned medals on his chest in classified ceremonies knew. And that was enough. That had always been enough. Until today. Until this moment. Until a black sedan with 4-star flags rolled to a stop and a door swung open and a man stepped out whose face Elias had not seen in 53 years. Rose saw it first. The 4 stars on the sedan's flags. The tall figure emerging, silver-haired and ramrod straight, despite his 68 years. General Marcus Webb, the keynote speaker, the most decorated officer to come out of the Vietnam generation, and prisoner number 32 from a camp in Laos that never existed. The general's eyes swept across the parade ground, taking in the formations, the memorial wall, the reviewing stand. And then they stopped, fixed on a point near the MPs, on a threadbare jacket, on medals that most people would dismiss as costume jewelry. General Webb went completely still, and Sergeant Major Rowe watched the color drain from his commanding officer's face as the most powerful man on that parade ground began walking directly toward them. Colonel Sterling did not notice the general approaching. He was too busy performing for his audience, turning in a slow circle to address the cadets who had broken their parade rest postures to watch the confrontation unfold. This is exactly the kind of fraud we must remain vigilant against, Sterling declared, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man who had rehearsed speeches in front of mirrors. Men like this prey on public sympathy. They wear medals they never earned, claim service they never rendered, and expect us to thank them for sacrifices they never made. Behind him, General Marcus Webb crossed the parade ground with long, deliberate strides. His aides scrambled to keep up, clutching the general's cover and a leather portfolio, confusion plain on his face. Protocol demanded that the general proceed directly to the reviewing stand where Academy leadership waited to greet him. Protocol demanded handshakes and photographs and the carefully choreographed rituals of military ceremony. General Webb was ignoring all of it. Cadet First Class Diana Chun had been documenting the Veterans Day preparations for the Academy newspaper when the confrontation began. Now she stood at the edge of the formation, her phone raised, recording everything. She had expected to capture footage of the general's arrival, perhaps a few quotes for her article about honoring those who served. Instead, she was watching her commandant publicly humiliate an elderly homeless man while a 4-star general walked toward them with an expression she could not quite read. "Sir," the staff sergeant MP said to Sterling, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. "Sir, General Webb is—" "Not now," Sterling snapped without turning around. "I am making a point." He stepped closer to Elias, close enough that his polished shoes nearly touched the old man's cracked leather boots. Boots held together with what appeared to be duct tape wrapped around the soles. Sterling looked down at them with theatrical disgust. "Special Forces," he repeated, loading the words with contempt. "Tell me, Master Sergeant," he spoke the rank like a slur, "which unit exactly? What years? What operations?" Elias met the colonel's eyes. For a moment, something flickered behind the watery blue. Something cold and precise that did not match the threadbare jacket or the trembling hands or the stooped posture of a man defeated by age and circumstance. 5th Special Forces Group, Elias said quietly. 1968 to 1979. Operations are classified, sir. Sterling's laugh echoed across the parade ground. Classified? Of course they are. How convenient that your entire service record is hidden behind a classification wall that no one can verify. The general was 40 feet away now. 30. His silver hair caught the weak November sunlight, and his jaw was set with an intensity that made his aide take an extra step back. Other officers had begun to notice. The Academy superintendent, a 2-star general named Morrison, stepped forward from the reviewing stand with a puzzled frown. Several cadets in the formation had recognized Webb from his official photographs. Whispers rippled through the ranks. "That is General Webb. Why is he walking that way? What is happening?" Sergeant Major Rowe positioned himself slightly between the colonel and Elias, not quite interfering, but creating a buffer. His eyes kept returning to the tattoo on the old man's forearm. The coordinates he knew by heart because his father had spoken them like a prayer. 20.4172 degrees north, 104.3725 degrees east. A valley in Laos where 47 Americans have been held in bamboo cages, written off as missing in action, presumed dead. Until one night in 1971 when a 12-man team ghosted through the jungle and brought them home. "Colonel," Rose said, his voice tight, "you need to stop. Right now." Sterling finally turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Sergeant Major, I have had enough of your—" The words died in his throat. General Webb stood 10 feet away. His 4 stars gleamed against the dark fabric of his service uniform. His ribbons formed a wall of color across his chest, row after row of commendations earned across 5 decades of service. His face, weathered by years in command, held an expression that made Sterling take an involuntary step backward. "General Webb," Sterling managed, his voice cracking upward. "Sir, I was not expecting you to— that is, the ceremony is prepared for your—" The general did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on Elias with an intensity that seemed to collapse the distance between them. He studied the threadbare jacket, the tarnished medals, the faded ribbons that Sterling had mocked as costume jewelry. And slowly, his gaze dropped to the forearm where the colonel's grip had pushed up the sleeve. The tattoo was still visible. The coordinates, the date, the number 47. General Webb's breath caught. It was a small sound, almost inaudible, but in the silence that had fallen across the parade ground, everyone heard it. "Elias," the general said. The single word came out rough, scraped raw by something that went deeper than surprise. Elias Thorne looked at the 4-star general standing before him. 53 years had passed since they had last seen each other. 53 years since a young lieutenant with a broken leg and 70 pounds of malnutrition had been carried through 18 kilometers of hostile jungle by a sergeant who refused to leave anyone behind. The lieutenant's face had aged into something distinguished, weathered by command and responsibility. But the eyes were the same. The eyes of prisoner number 32. "General Webb," Elias said softly. "It has been a long time, sir." Sterling's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His mind raced to process what he was witnessing. The general knew this vagrant, knew him by name, spoke to him with a familiarity that suggested history, shared experience, something that Sterling's academy education and career management had never prepared him to understand. "You know this man?" Sterling heard himself say. The words sounded distant, like someone else was speaking them. General Webb finally turned to look at the colonel. His expression was unreadable, but something behind his eyes made Sterling's stomach clench with sudden, terrible understanding. "Know him," Webb repeated. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the silent parade ground with the weight of 5 decades of unspoken gratitude. "Colonel, this man saved my life." The words hung in the November air. Cadets exchanged stunned glances. Officers on the reviewing stand leaned forward. Cadet Chin's phone trembled slightly as she continued recording. And Colonel Bradford Sterling felt his career, his ambitions, his carefully constructed future begin to crack like ice beneath his feet. Sergeant Major Rowe closed his eyes. His father had been right. All those stories, all those reverent whispers about the man called Shepard, they were all true. And now, standing on this parade ground, the legend had finally stepped into the light. "Saved your life." Sterling repeated the words as if speaking a foreign language. "Sir, I do not understand. This man is clearly a vagrant. His medals are obviously real." General Webb cut him off without raising his voice. The quiet authority in that single word silenced the colonel more effectively than any shouted command. "Every medal on his chest is real, Colonel. I was present when most of them were pinned there." The parade ground had gone completely still. Even the November wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Cadets stood frozen in their formations. Officers on the reviewing stand watched with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. And Colonel Bradford Sterling stood paralyzed, his mind scrambling to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable. Elias had not moved. His hands remained at his sides, still and scarred, his posture unchanged despite the general's revelation. 53 years ago, he had carried this man through a jungle that wanted to kill them both. He had not done it for recognition then. He had done it because leaving men behind was not something Elias Thorne knew how to do. "General," Elias said quietly, "you do not need to." Webb held up a hand, and the gesture carried the weight of command that came from decades of leading men into and out of impossible situations. "I need you to be quiet for a moment, Master Sergeant. Just this once, let someone else speak for you." He turned to face Sterling fully, and the colonel took another involuntary step backward. The four-star general was not a physically imposing man, but something in his bearing made him seem to fill the entire parade ground. In 1971, Webb began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled cadets. "I was a 23-year-old lieutenant. Idealistic, arrogant, certain that I understood war because I had read books about it. And then I was captured." He paused, letting the words settle. "I spent 14 months in a camp that did not officially exist. A camp in Laos where the enemy held Americans they were not supposed to have, in a country we were not supposed to be in. 47 of us, held in bamboo cages, written off by our own government as missing in action." Sterling's face had gone the color of old paper. Behind him, Sergeant Major Rowe stood at rigid attention, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, listening to a story his father had told him 100 times, now being spoken aloud by one of the men who had lived it. "We had given up hope," Webb continued. 14 months of starvation and disease and interrogation. Men died around us, one by one, and we buried them in shallow graves and wondered which of us would be next. And then one night, the guard started screaming. Elias closed his eyes. He did not want to remember. He had spent 53 years trying not to remember. But the memories came anyway, rising unbidden like floodwater. The insertion at 0200, 12 men dropping in a jungle so thick the moonlight could not penetrate. The 18-kilometer march through terrain that fought them with every step, leeches and snakes and trip wires, and the constant knowledge that a single mistake would kill them all. The camp appearing through the trees like something from a nightmare. Bamboo cages arranged in rows, skeletal figures barely visible in the darkness. And then the assault. 3 minutes of controlled violence that felt like 3 hours. His team moving through the camp like ghosts, silent and lethal, while he cut through bamboo with a knife his father had given him. A 12-man team came through that jungle, Webb said, led by a sergeant who had volunteered for a mission everyone expected to be suicide. They killed every guard in that camp without losing a single man in the initial assault. And then they carried us out. 47 prisoners, most of us too weak to walk, through 18 kilometers of hostile territory with enemy patrols hunting us every step of the way. Webb's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to compose himself. When he spoke again, the words were quieter but no less powerful. 3 of his men died during the extraction. He was wounded twice, and he never stopped moving. He carried 4 of us the last 6 kilometers himself, rotating between us, refusing to leave anyone behind no matter how many times we begged him to save himself. Sterling opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, but no sound emerged. His career was disintegrating in front of him, and he could not find words to stop it. "I was prisoner number 32, Webb said. "I was 23 years old, and I had a broken leg, and I weighed perhaps 100 pounds. And this man," he pointed at Elias, "carried me through that jungle on his back. When I told him to leave me, he said 6 words I have never forgotten." The general turned to look at Elias, and his eyes were wet. He said, "We do not leave our own behind." Elias opened his eyes. The memory was still there, raw and vivid, but something else was there too. The young lieutenant's face, gaunt and terrified, looking up at him from the bamboo cage. The weight of him across Elias's shoulders during those final kilometers. The moment when they reached the extraction point and the helicopters descended like mechanical angels and the lieutenant, barely conscious, had gripped his hand and whispered thank you. That lieutenant had become a general. That general had remembered. And now, standing on a parade ground where his son's name was carved in a stone, Elias felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been frozen for a very long time. Webb turned back to Sterling. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried an edge that made the colonel flinch. So tell me, Colonel, tell me again about the vagrant in the costume jewelry. Tell me again about the parasite preying on real veterans. I want to hear you say it while you're looking at a Medal of Honor recipient who saved 47 American lives, including mine. Sterling could not speak. His throat had closed around words that would not come. Behind him, Sergeant Major Rowe allowed himself one small, grim smile. His father had always said that someday, somehow, the truth about Shepard would come to light. He just never imagined it would happen like this. The silence stretched across the parade ground like a held breath. Colonel Sterling stood frozen, his face cycling through shades of white and gray as the full weight of his error pressed down upon him. Around them, cadets remained locked in place, witnesses to a moment that would be discussed in academy hallways for decades to come. General Webb had not finished. He stepped closer to Sterling, close enough that the colonel could see the fine lines around the general's eyes, the weathering of a face that had seen things most men only read about in history books. I want to make sure you understand something, Colonel. Webb's voice was low now, meant only for Sterling, but carrying in the stillness nonetheless. The operation that saved my life, that saved 46 other Americans, is still classified. It is taught at war colleges under code names. Tacticians study it as one of the most successful extraction missions in the history of unconventional warfare. Sterling's throat worked convulsively. Sir, I had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing. Webb cut him off. You could have looked at this man's bearing. You could have noticed the way he stands, the way he holds himself, even now. You could have seen the scars on his hands. You could have asked a single respectful question instead of assuming the worst. The general's voice rose slightly, carrying across the formation. But you did not see a veteran, Colonel. You saw a homeless man in old clothes, and you decided that was all he could be. You let appearance blind you to everything else. Elias watched the exchange without expression. Part of him wanted to intervene, to tell the general that it did not matter, that he had not come here for recognition or vindication. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for a very long time, understood that this was not about him anymore. This was about something larger. Sir, the voice came from behind Sterling, and everyone turned. Sergeant Major Rowe stepped forward, his bearing rigid with military formality. Permission to speak, General. Webb nodded. My father served in Vietnam, sir. He was with the 101st Airborne, but he knew men who were at that camp. He spoke of the rescue his entire life. Rowe's voice was steady, but something raw lay beneath it. He spoke of a man called Shepard, a sergeant who led the extraction team. He said that in the Special Forces community, that name was spoken with more reverence than any general or politician. Webb's expression shifted, softening slightly. Your father knew the story. Yes, sir. He said Shepard was the finest soldier he ever heard of, that the men who served under him would have followed him into hell itself. Rowe paused, his eyes moving to Elias. He said that after the war, Shepard disappeared, walked away from everything. No one knew what happened to him. The general nodded slowly. Master Sergeant Thorne retired in 1979. His wife was ill. He wanted to be home with her. Margaret. The name surfaced in Elias's mind like a bubble rising through dark water. Margaret, who had waited for him through 3 tours. Margaret, who had held him through the nightmares and never asked him to explain. Margaret, who had given him David and then given him 32 years of peace before the cancer came. She passed 12 years ago, Elias heard himself say. The words came out before he could stop them, pulled from somewhere deep. And our son, David, he graduated from this academy. Class of 2004. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cadets exchanged glances. The name David Thorne meant nothing to most of them, but they understood loss. They understood sacrifice. Webb's expression shifted again, something darker passing across his features. He turned to his aide, who had been standing frozen with the general's cover still clutched in his hands. "Find out," Webb said quietly. The aide fumbled with his phone, fingers trembling as he searched. Seconds passed that felt like hours. And then he leaned close to the general and whispered something that made Webb close his eyes. When the general opened them again, they were wet. "Colonel Sterling." Webb's voice had changed, stripped of its commanding edge, replaced by something worse. Something that made Sterling want to disappear entirely. "Do you know which name on that memorial wall this man came to see?" Sterling shook his head, unable to speak. Webb pointed toward the curved granite wall where names were carved in endless rows. Third panel. Second row. Captain David Thorne. Kia, Afghanistan. 2008. The words fell across the parade ground like stones into still water. His only son, Webb continued, a graduate of this academy, killed in action 16 years ago. And this man, this Medal of Honor recipient who saved my life and 46 others, came here today not to be recognized, not to be honored. He came here to touch his son's name on that wall, and you try to have him arrested for it. Sterling's knees seemed to weaken. He did not fall, but something in his posture crumbled, the rigid confidence of moments ago collapsing into something smaller. Behind him, Cadet Chun continued recording, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She had come to document a ceremony. Instead, she was witnessing something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The staff sergeant MP who had hesitated earlier stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Elias, his voice rough, "I served in Afghanistan, 2010 to 2012. I did not know your son personally, but I know men who did. Everyone spoke highly of him, sir." Elias looked at the young man, saw the ribbons on his chest, the same desert tan that David had worn, the same quiet weight behind the eyes that came from seeing things that could not be unseen. "Thank you," Elias said softly. It was the first time his voice had carried anything other than resignation. General Webb moved to stand beside Elias, shoulder to shoulder, facing Colonel Sterling. The contrast between them was stark and devastating. The threadbare jacket beside the four-star uniform, the tarnished medals beside the gleaming ribbons. And yet somehow, in that moment, it was clear which man commanded the greater respect. "Colonel," Webb said, "I think we need to have a conversation about what happens next." Sterling opened his mouth, but no words came. His career, his ambitions, his carefully constructed future lay in ruins around him. And on the memorial wall behind them all, the name David Thorne caught the November light, carved forever in stone. The November wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of coming rain across the parade ground. Cadets in formation shivered slightly, but did not move. They understood, perhaps for the first time in their academy careers, that they were witnessing something their textbooks could never teach. General Webb turned to the academy superintendent, General Morrison, who had left the reviewing stand and now stood at the edge of the gathering with an expression caught between shock and dawning comprehension. "General Morrison," Webb said, his voice resuming its tone of command, "I believe the ceremony schedule needs to be adjusted." Morrison nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Whatever you need." Webb looked at Elias, studying the threadbare jacket and the tarnished medals with an expression that held something far deeper than military courtesy. "Master Sergeant Thorne came here to pay respects to his son. I think we should give him the opportunity to do that properly. And I think every cadet on this parade ground should understand exactly who is walking among them today." Sterling made a sound, something between a protest and a plea. "General, sir, perhaps we could discuss this privately before?" Webb silenced him with a look. "You will have your opportunity to speak, Colonel. But right now, you will stand there and you will watch. That is an order." The general extended his hand toward the memorial wall. "Elias, would you allow me to accompany you?" Elias hesitated. For 12 years, he had visited memorials alone. He had stood before walls and headstones in the early morning hours when no one else was present, speaking to ghosts in whispered conversations that no living person was meant to hear. Grief had become a private ritual, something he protected with the same fierce determination he had once brought to combat. But something in Webb's eyes stopped him from refusing. something that spoke of shared loss and shared survival, of nights when the memories came flooding back and there was no one to understand. The young lieutenant he had carried through the jungle had become a general, but the weight of what they had survived together had never fully lifted from either of them. "Yes, sir," Elias said quietly. "I would be honored." They walked together across the parade ground, the four-star general and the homeless veteran in the threadbare jacket. Behind them, the crowd parted instinctively. Cadets straightened to attention as they passed. Officers who had spent their careers studying military bearing now watched a masterclass in dignity they would never forget. Sergeant Major Rowe fell in a step behind them, and after a moment, the staff's sergeant MP followed. Then other veterans in the crowd, men and women who had served and recognized the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. A procession formed without orders, without protocol, guided only by an unspoken understanding. Colonel Sterling remained where he stood, alone, watching the growing line of people following the two men toward the memorial wall. His aide had abandoned him. His subordinates had turned away. Even the cadets in formation seemed to be looking through him rather than at him. "This is not happening," he muttered to himself. "This cannot be happening." But it was. The memorial wall rose before them, curved granite carved with names in precise rows. Elias had seen it from a distance 100 times, standing at the edges of the academy grounds during previous Veterans Days, watching from the shadows as families traced their fingers across letters that spelled out everything they had lost. Today, for the first time in 16 years, he would touch his son's name without hiding. "Third panel," Webb said softly. He had done his research in the moments since his aide whispered the truth. "Second row, from the top." Elias nodded. His eyes had already found it. The letters that spelled out everything he had been and everything he had lost. Captain David Thorne, Kia, Afghanistan, 2008, class of 2004. He reached out slowly, his scarred fingers trembling slightly as they approached the granite. The stone was cold beneath his touch, smoothed by years of weather and countless hands that had traced these names before him. He let his fingertips rest against the carved letters, feeling the shape of his son's name like Braille. "I am here, David," he whispered. The words were not meant for anyone else, but in the silence that had fallen, they carried. "I am sorry it took me so long to come in the daylight." Behind him, cadets and officers and veterans stood in witness. Some had removed their covers in respect. Others stood at rigid attention. Cadet Chun had lowered her phone, no longer recording, understanding that some moments were too sacred to document. General Webb stood beside Elias, close enough to offer support, but not so close as to intrude. His own memories were surfacing, unbidden. The bamboo cage, the endless nights, the moment when hope had died and then, impossibly, been resurrected by a sergeant who refused to accept the impossible. He owed this man everything. His career, his family, his grandchildren. Every breath he had drawn for 53 years had been a gift from the scarred hands now pressed against cold granite. "Tell me about him," Webb said softly. "Tell me about David." Elias was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with decades of suppressed grief. "He was better than me," Elias said. "Smarter. Kinda. He had his mother's eyes and her laugh. When he was 8, he told me he wanted to be a soldier like his dad. I tried to talk him out of it. Told him about the nightmares, about the friends I lost, about the cost. He listened to everything I said, and then he told me that was exactly why he had to serve, because men like me needed men like him to carry the weight forward." Webb closed his eyes. "That sounds like a leader." He was. Elias's voice broke slightly. His men loved him. The letters they sent after, they said he died saving 3 of them. Drew fire so they could reach cover. Just like I taught him. Just like he could not finish. The words dissolved into a silence that said everything. General Webb reached out and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of 53 years of gratitude and the shared understanding of men who had both lost more than they could ever explain. "He will be proud of you," Webb said quietly, "for coming here today, for standing tall even when they try to break you down." Elias shook his head slowly. I'm not tall, General. I have not been tall in a long time. Webb's grip tightened on his shoulder. You were standing in front of your son's name, in front of every cadet at this academy, after being publicly humiliated. And you have not broken. You have not raged. You have not demanded anything. He paused. That is the tallest any man can stand, Master Sergeant. On the memorial wall, the name David Thorne caught the gray November light. And for the first time in 16 years, his father stood before it without shame, without hiding, without apology. The healing had not begun yet. But somewhere deep inside Elias Thorne, something that had been frozen for a very long time began to crack. The wind shifted, carrying the first drops of rain across the parade ground. They fell against the memorial wall like tears, darkening the granite, pooling in the carved letters of names that would never be forgotten. Elias did not move. His fingers remained pressed against his son's name, anchoring him to the only thing that still felt real. Around him, the crowd waited in silence. No one suggested moving to shelter. No one checked watches or shifted impatiently. The rain fell, and the veterans stood, and the cadets remained at attention, understanding without being told that this moment belonged to the old man at the wall. General Webb finally broke the stillness. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of decision. Master Sergeant Thorne, the ceremony today was meant to honor veterans. I cannot think of anyone more deserving of that honor than you. Would you allow us to recognize you properly? Elias turned slowly, his hand falling away from the granite. Raindrops caught in his white stubble and ran down the creases of his weathered face. For a moment, he looked every one of his 78 years, bent by time and loss and the accumulated weight of a life spent carrying others. General, I did not come here for recognition. His voice was steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. I came to see my son. That is all I wanted. Webb nodded. I understand, and I respect that more than I can say. But these cadets, he gestured toward the formations, still standing at attention in the rain. They need to see what real service looks like. Not the polished version they read about in textbooks. The real thing. The cost of it. The weight of it. He paused, letting his words settle. You saved 47 men, and you never asked for anything in return. You lost your wife, your son, and you never asked for help. You came here today to touch a name on a wall, and you were treated like a criminal. His voice hardened slightly. Let us give these young men and women something true to remember. Let them see that honor is not about rank or uniform or medals. It is about character. And you, Master Sergeant, have more character than anyone I have ever known. Elias was silent for a long moment. The rain continued to fall, soaking through his threadbare jacket, plastering his white hair against his scalp. He should have been cold. He should have been miserable. But something else was happening inside him, something that had nothing to do with weather. For 12 years, he had hidden, from family, from friends, from anyone who might try to help. He had convinced himself that he deserved the cold and the hunger and the loneliness, that surviving when Margaret and David had not was a sin that required penance, that the only honorable thing left was to disappear. But now, standing in the rain with a 4-star general waiting for his answer, with cadets and veterans watching him with something that looked like reverence, he felt the foundations of that belief beginning to shift. David would not have wanted this, he realized. David would have been furious to see his father living under bridges, refusing help, punishing himself for crimes he had not committed. David, who had inherited his mother's practicality along with her eyes, would have grabbed him by the shoulders and told him to stop being a stubborn fool. I can almost hear you, son. Elias thought the words rather than speaking them, telling me to stand up straight, to stop hiding, to be the father you always believed I was. He looked at Webb, at the silver eagles on his shoulders turned dark by rain, at the face of a man who had spent 53 years trying to live a life worthy of his rescue. If it would help them, Elias said slowly, then yes. I will stay. Webb's expression shifted, something loosening behind his eyes that might have been relief or gratitude or both. He turned to General Morrison. I want the ceremony restructured, Webb said. Master Sergeant Thorne will be seated in the place of honor. I will be revising my remarks to include the full story of Operation Homecoming, and I want every cadet to understand exactly what they are witnessing today. Morrison nodded quickly, already gesturing to his staff. Of course, sir. We will make arrangements immediately. Webb turned back to Elias. There is a seat on the reviewing stand. Dry. Covered. Will you take it? Elias glanced back at the memorial wall, at the names still glistening with rain. He had spent so many years standing at the edges of things, watching from shadows, refusing to take anything that might be construed as comfort or recognition. The reviewing stand, with its covered seating and distinguished guests, felt like a betrayal of the penance he had imposed upon himself. But David's name was still there, would still be there after the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed. And David, he knew with sudden certainty, would want him to come in from the rain. Yes, sir, Elias said. I will take it. Webb smiled, the first genuine smile Elias had seen from him. Then let us get you out of this weather. They walked together toward the reviewing stand, the crowd parting before them once again. Sergeant Major Rowe fell in a step on Elias's other side, and the Staff Sergeant MP followed close behind. Other veterans joined the escort, forming a protective circle around the old man in the threadbare jacket. Colonel Sterling still stood where they had left him, rain soaking through his perfectly pressed uniform, his carefully styled hair plastered against his forehead. No one had offered him shelter. No one had acknowledged his existence. He had become invisible, a ghost of his former authority, watching his career wash away with the November rain. As they passed him, Elias paused. The movement was so unexpected that Webb and Rowe stopped as well, turning to see what had caught his attention. Elias looked at Sterling for a long moment. The colonel flinched, expecting condemnation, expecting the verbal assault he knew he deserved. But the old man's eyes held no anger, no satisfaction at his humiliation, only something that looked impossibly like understanding. We all make mistakes, Colonel, Elias said quietly. The measure of a man is not in his errors. It is in what he does after. Then he turned and continued walking toward the reviewing stand, leaving Sterling standing alone in the rain with words that cut deeper than any rebuke ever could. Because kindness from a man he had tried to destroy was worse than hatred. It left no room for excuses, no room for self-justification, only the raw, unfiltered truth of what he had become. And Colonel Bradford Sterling, for the first time in his career, had absolutely no idea what to do next. The reviewing stand had been transformed in the minutes since Webb issued his orders. Aides scrambled to rearrange seating. The academy superintendent personally escorted Elias to a chair at the center of the front row, a position normally reserved for visiting heads of state or the highest-ranking dignitaries. A cadet appeared with a towel and a cup of hot coffee, pressing both into Elias's hands with a reverence that made the old man uncomfortable. Sir, the cadet said quietly, it is an honor. Elias looked up at the young face, smooth and earnest, untouched by the things that carved lines into older men. The cadet could not have been more than 20, David's age when he had sat in these same seats, dreaming of the future. Thank you, Elias managed. What is your name? Cadet Second Class Robert Shun, sir. He paused, something flickering across his expression. My sister is the one who has been recording everything. She's going to be a journalist. I think she believes this story needs to be told. Elias glanced toward the edge of the reviewing stand where Cadet First Class Diana Chun stood with her phone lowered, watching the proceedings with wet eyes. Brother and sister, both witnesses to this moment, both carrying it forward in their own ways. Your sister has good instincts, Elias said. And so do you. The cadet smiled, then stepped back to his position. Around the reviewing stand, the ceremony was reassembling itself. Cadets marched into new formations. Officers took their seats. The rain had softened to a mist that hung in the air like gauze, diffusing the gray November light. General Webb approached the podium that had been set up at the front of the stand. He had not changed out of his rain-soaked uniform. The water stains on his jacket seemed almost intentional, a visual reminder of what had transpired on the parade ground below. He looked out at the assembled crowd. Hundreds of faces looked back. Cadets in formation. officers in the stands, veterans who had come to honor their fallen, families who had traveled to see their children recognized. And at the center of the front row, an old man in a threadbare jacket, holding a cup of coffee like it was something precious. Webb cleared his throat. I had prepared remarks for today, he began. Statistics about service, quotes from generals and presidents, the usual ceremony language that we use to honor those who served. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I am setting those remarks aside. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Webb waited for it to fade before continuing. What happened on this parade ground today is something that cannot be addressed with prepared speeches. It requires truth, and truth, in my experience, is rarely comfortable. He looked directly at Elias. In 1971, I was a prisoner of war in a camp that did not officially exist. I had been there for 14 months. I had watched friends die. I had given up hope of ever seeing my family again. And then one night, a team of 12 men came through the jungle and carried us home. The crowd was utterly silent. Even a mist seemed to pause. The man who led that team is sitting in the front row of this reviewing stand. His name is Elias Thorne. His call sign was Shepherd. And for the past 53 years, he has never spoken publicly about what he did. He received his Medal of Honor in a classified ceremony. His operations remain sealed to this day. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He simply did his duty and then went home to raise his family. Webb's voice tightened slightly. His wife passed away 12 years ago. His son, Captain David Thorne, a graduate of this academy, was killed in Afghanistan in 2008. And today, Master Sergeant Thorne came to this parade ground not for recognition, not for honor, but simply to touch his son's name on the memorial wall. He turned to face Colonel Sterling, who stood at the far edge of the reviewing stand, isolated, his uniform still dripping from the rain. And he was treated like a criminal. The words hung in the air. Sterling seemed to shrink further into himself, his face a mask of barely contained anguish. I want every cadet here to understand something, Webb continued, turning back to the crowd. The measure of a soldier is not in the uniform he wears or the medals on his chest. It is in how he treats those who cannot fight back. It is in the dignity he shows to those society has forgotten. It is in the choices he makes when no one is watching. He pointed toward Elias. This man spent his life protecting others. He carried wounded soldiers through jungles. He raised a son who died protecting his men. And when he was publicly humiliated today, when he was called a fraud and a parasite and a thief, he did not rage. He did not demand justice. He simply stood there with quiet dignity and waited for the truth to emerge. Webb's voice rose slightly, carrying across the silent parade ground. That is what honor looks like. Not the polished version in your textbooks. The real thing, worn and weathered and holding itself together with nothing but character. He paused, gathering himself. Master Sergeant Thorne saved 47 American lives. He lost 3 of his own men doing it. He was wounded twice and kept moving. And when it was over, he went home and never spoke of it again. Not for glory, not for recognition, because that is not who he is. Webb turned to face Elias directly. Master Sergeant Thorne, on behalf of the 47 men whose lives you saved, on behalf of their families, their children, their grandchildren, everyone who exists because you refuse to leave us behind, I want to say something that is 53 years overdue. The general came to attention. His hand rose to his brow in a salute that carried the weight of half a century. Thank you. The words echoed across the parade ground. And then, one by one, the cadets in formation raised their hands as well. Officers in the reviewing stand followed. Veterans in the crowd. Families who had come to honor their own. Hundreds of salutes, rising like a wave, all directed at the old man in the threadbare jacket who sat frozen in his seat, unable to move, unable to speak, watching through eyes that had finally, after all these years, begun to fill with tears. Elias Thorne had spent 12 years believing he deserved nothing. And now, surrounded by salutes, he could not remember why. The salutes held for what felt like an eternity. Elias sat motionless, the coffee cup trembling slightly in his grip, watching hundreds of hands raised in tribute to a man who had spent 12 years sleeping under bridges and eating from shelter kitchens. The disconnect between what he saw and what he believed about himself was so vast that his mind could not bridge it. Then General Webb lowered his hand, and the rest followed like a wave receding. At ease, Webb said softly, though the words were unnecessary. The crowd had already begun to stir, the silence giving way to murmurs and whispered conversations and the sound of people wiping their eyes. Webb stepped away from the podium and walked to where Elias sat. He lowered himself into the empty chair beside the old man, ignoring the aides who hovered nearby with schedules and protocols that no longer seemed to matter. "How are you holding up?" Webb asked quietly. Elias shook his head slowly. "I do not know how to answer that, General." "Marcus." Webb's voice was gentle. "I think after 53 years, you can call me Marcus." Elias looked at him. The 4 stars, the ribbons, the silver hair and weathered face of a man who had risen to the highest ranks of military service. And beneath all of it, the eyes of a 23-year-old lieutenant who had whispered "thank you" in the darkness of a jungle that wanted to kill them both. "Marcus," Elias repeated. The name felt strange on his tongue. He had not spoken it since 1971, since the extraction point, since the helicopters lifted them out of hell and carried them toward home. "I spent a long time looking for you," Webb said. "After I recovered, after I returned to service, I tried to find out what happened to the men who saved us. Most of them scattered. Some went back for more tours. A few did not make it home. But you," he paused, "you disappeared completely. I had Margaret to come home to," Elias said. "And then David. They were enough." Webb nodded slowly. "I understand, but I need you to know something. Every decision I made after that night, every promotion I accepted, every command I took, I made because of you. Because you show me what leadership really looked like. Not the textbook version, the real thing." Elias said nothing. The weight of Webb's words pressed against the walls he had built around himself. Walls constructed from grief and guilt and the certainty that he deserved nothing good. Around them, the ceremony was resuming in a modified form. General Morrison had taken the podium and was speaking about sacrifice and service, but his words seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the face of what had already transpired. The real ceremony had happened on the parade ground below, in the rain, when truth had finally caught up with a man who had spent half a century running from recognition. A commotion at the edge of the reviewing stand caught Elias's attention. He turned to see a woman in her 60s pushing past the security detail, her face streaked with tears, her hands reaching toward him. "Shepard," she called out. The word carried across the stand, cutting through Morrison's speech. "Shepard, please." Webb rose, his hand moving instinctively to intercept the woman, but something in her expression made him pause. She was not a threat. She was something else entirely. "My father," she said, reaching the front row and falling to her knees before Elias. "My father was prisoner number 7, William Hartley. He passed away last year, but he talked about you until his final breath. He said you carried him for 3 kilometers when his legs gave out. He said you would not leave him even when the patrol almost found us." Elias stared at her. The names surfaced from memories he had buried so deep he thought they were gone. William Hartley, a sergeant with a broken ankle and dysentery and a stubborn refusal to die that had kept him alive for 13 months in captivity. "I remember him," Elias said softly. "He was stronger than he knew." The woman gripped his hands, her tears falling freely. "He looked for you. For years, he looked. He wanted to thank you. He wanted you to know that he lived a full life because of what you did. He had children, grandchildren. You got to see them grow up." Her voice broke. "I have a daughter who just graduated from medical school. She exists because of you. My father's entire lineage exists because you would not leave him behind." Elias's hands trembled in hers. For 12 years, he had told himself that his life no longer mattered, that the world had moved on without him, that the men he saved had forgotten the sergeant who carried them through the jungle. But here was proof that he was wrong. Living, breathing, weeping proof. Other people were approaching now. Men and women of various ages, some in military uniform, others in civilian clothes. They gathered at the edges of the reviewing stand, waiting for their chance to speak. Children of the 47, grandchildren, spouses of men who had passed, but left behind stories of the night they were saved. My grandfather was prisoner number 19, a young man in an army dress uniform said. He told me about you every Christmas. You were his hero. My mother was a nurse who treated the men. When they came home, an older woman added. She said she had never seen anything like the wounds you carried, that you should not have been able to walk, let alone carry others. You saved my uncle, another voice called out. He never stopped praying for you. The voices overlapped, washed over him, filled the spaces in his soul that he had thought were permanently empty. Elias looked at the faces surrounding him, at the tears and the gratitude and the generations of life that had sprouted from a single night in a jungle 53 years ago. He had thought he was alone. He had thought he was forgotten. He had thought the world no longer had a place for men like him. He was wrong. General Webb placed a hand on his shoulder and leaned close. This is your legacy, Shepard. Not the medals, not the citations. These people, these lives. This is what you built. Elias could not speak. For the first time in 12 years, he did not need to. The evidence surrounded him, living and breathing and weeping with gratitude. And somewhere deep inside, the ice that had encased his heart for so long began to shatter. The ceremony had officially ended an hour ago, but no one had left. The reviewing stand had become a gathering place, a spontaneous reunion of lives connected by a single night in 1971. Families of the 47 shared photographs and stories. Veterans who had served in different eras found common ground in their respect for the old man at the center of it all. Cadets lingered at the edges, watching, learning something that no classroom could ever teach. General Webb had stepped away to make phone calls. Elias could hear fragments of the conversations, words like documentation and recognition and long overdue, but he was not paying attention. His focus was on the faces surrounding him, on the hands that reached out to touch his arm, his shoulder, his scarred fingers, as if physical contact could convey what words could not. A man in his 50s approached, wearing the dress uniform of a retired Marine colonel. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw tight with barely contained emotion. Master Sergeant Thorne, he said, my name is James Hartley. William Hartley was my father. The woman who had knelt before Elias earlier stepped aside, making room for her brother. The resemblance was clear now, the same strong jaw, the same determined eyes that their father must have carried through those 13 months in captivity. He passed last year, James continued. Pancreatic cancer. Quick, at least. But before he went, he made me promise something. Elias waited, his throat too tight for words. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I would give you this. James reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. A challenge coin, worn smooth by decades of handling. The insignia of the 5th Special Forces Group still visible on its face. He carried this every day of his life, James said. He told me you pressed it into his hand when the helicopters came, told him to hold on to it, that it would bring him home. He kept that promise for 53 years. Elias stared at the coin. He remembered giving it away, remembered the young sergeant's fingers closing around the metal, remembered whispering words of encouragement as the rotor wash beat down around them. He always said he was holding it for you, James continued, that someday he would find you and give it back. He did not get that chance. But I am here, and I'm keeping his promise. He pressed the coin into Elias's palm. The metal was warm, heated by the pocket of a son honoring his father's dying wish. Elias closed his fingers around it. The weight was negligible, an ounce of metal at most, but it felt heavier than anything he had carried in years. Your father was a good man, Elias managed. Strong. He never gave up. Neither did you, James said. And because of that, I got 47 more years with him. My children knew their grandfather. My daughter just had her first baby. He got to hold his great-grandchild before he passed. He gripped Elias's shoulder. You gave us that. All of it. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment we had with him. That was your gift to us. Elias could not respond. The words lodged in his throat, blocked by decades of suppressed grief, finally finding release. General Webb returned, his phone still in his hand. His expression had shifted, carrying something that looked like determination mixed with satisfaction. "Master Sergeant Thorne," he said, "I have been making some calls. It seems that your situation has attracted attention at the highest levels." Elias looked up, confusion cutting through his emotional overwhelm. "My situation? You have been living in a veteran shelter for the past 3 years," Webb said. "Before that, you were on the streets. The Medal of Honor Society has been trying to locate you for over a decade. The VA has a file on you that lists you as missing. And the Secretary of Defense has personally expressed interest in ensuring that you receive the support you should have had all along." The words washed over Elias without fully registering. He had spent so long avoiding systems, avoiding help, avoiding anything that might suggest he deserved better than what he had. "General," he started, "I do not need—" "With respect," Webb cut him off, "you do not get to decide that anymore. You spent 53 years giving everything and asking for nothing. It is time for that to change." He crouched down so that he was at eye level with Elias, his 4 stars brushing against the threadbare sleeve of the old man's jacket. "I have a guest house," Webb said quietly. "Nothing fancy, but it is warm. It is dry, and there is a place at my table for as long as you want it. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just an open door." Elias shook his head slowly. "I cannot accept that." "Why not?" "Because I do not deserve it." Webb's expression tightened. "Deserve it? Elias, you saved my life. You saved 46 other lives. You raised a son who died protecting his men. You have given everything and taken nothing. And somehow you have convinced yourself that you deserve to sleep under bridges." He gripped both of Elias's shoulders, forcing the old man to meet his eyes. "That ends today. Do you understand me? That ends right now. You're coming home with me. And tomorrow, we're going to start figuring out how to give you the life you should have had all along." Elias looked at the faces surrounding him. The families of the 47, the veterans who had gathered in tribute, the cadets who watched with expressions of awe, and behind them all, visible through the crowd, the memorial wall where his son's name was carved in stone. David would have wanted this, he realized. Margaret would have demanded it. The people he loved, the people he had lost, none of them would have accepted his self-imposed exile. "All right," Elias said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right." Webb's face broke into a smile that erased decades of military bearing. "Good. Now, let us get you somewhere warm." He helped Elias to his feet. The crowd parted as they walked, and this time, instead of suspicious stares or dismissive glances, every face held respect, gratitude, recognition. Colonel Sterling stood at the far edge of the reviewing stand, watching. His uniform had dried, but his expression remained haunted. Webb paused as they passed him. "Colonel," Webb said, "I expect your resignation letter on my desk by end of week. Consider it a courtesy that I am not pursuing formal charges." Sterling opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to apologize, but no words came. He simply nodded, a broken man watching his career end with a single sentence. Elias stopped. He looked at Sterling for a long moment. "The offer I made still stands," Colonel Elias said quietly. "The measure of a man is not in his errors. It is in what he does after." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Sterling with the only lifeline he would receive. Whether the colonel would take it remained to be seen. But Elias Thorne had learned something today. Mercy was not weakness. Grace was not surrender. And sometimes the hardest battle was not the one fought in jungles or on battlefields. Sometimes the hardest battle was simply learning to accept that you deserve to be saved. The guest house sat at the edge of General Webb's property, a small cottage with white clapboard siding and a porch that overlooked a garden Margaret would have loved. Elias stood at the window of the bedroom, watching the November sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, and tried to remember the last time he had slept in a real bed. 3 years in the shelter. 4 years before that on the streets. The math was simple, but the weight of it was staggering. 7 years since he had known anything resembling a home. Webb had left him alone to settle in, promising dinner at the main house in an hour. The room was simple but warm, furnished with a bed covered in a thick quilt, a dresser, a small desk by the window. On the desk sat a framed photograph that had not been there when Elias first arrived. He picked it up with trembling hands. The image showed a group of men in jungle fatigues, faces painted, weapons held with casual competence. 12 men standing before a helicopter, exhaustion etched into every line of their bodies, but something like triumph burning in their eyes. The date stamp in the corner read March 1971. Elias recognized every face. Thompson, who had taken a bullet through the shoulder and kept moving. Rodriguez, who had carried the radio despite a broken wrist. Patterson and Mills and Hawkins and the others, some living, some long gone. And at the center of the group, a younger version of himself, holding a wounded lieutenant across his shoulders. Prisoner number 32. Marcus Webb. A knock came at the door. Elias set the photograph down and crossed the room to open it. Sergeant Major Rowe stood on the porch, still in uniform, his expression carrying something between reverence and uncertainty. Master Sergeant Thorne, he said, I hope I'm not intruding. Elias stepped back to let him enter. You are not. What can I do for you, Sergeant Major? Rowe removed his cover and held it in his hands, turning it slowly as he gathered his thoughts. I wanted to speak with you privately. About my father. Elias gestured to the chair by the desk. Rowe sat, and Elias lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, waiting. His name was Thomas Rowe, the sergeant major began. He served with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam. He was not one of the 47, but he knew men who were. He knew the stories. He knew your call sign. Shepherd, Elias said quietly. Rowe nodded. He spoke of you like other men speak of saints. Said you were the finest soldier he had ever heard of, and he heard aplenty. Said that if he ever had a son, he would raise him to be half the man you were. He paused, his jaw tightening. I joined the Army because of those stories. Became a Green Beret because I wanted to live up to what he described. Spent my entire career trying to be worthy of a legacy he talked about. And today, I watched my commanding officer try to have you arrested for stolen valor. Elias said nothing. There was nothing to say. When I saw that tattoo, Rowe continued, I knew. The coordinates, the number, everything my father described. And I tried to warn the colonel. I tried to stop what was happening. But I did not try hard enough. His voice cracked. I should have stepped between you. I should have refused the order to stand down. I should have done more. Elias leaned forward. You did enough, Sergeant Major. You recognized the truth when others could not see it. That matters. It does not feel like enough. Elias studied the younger man's face, seeing the guilt written there, recognizing it as the same weight he had carried for so many years. The weight of believing you should have done more. Could have done more. Would have done more if only you'd been stronger, faster, better. Let me tell you something about your father, Elias said. I did not know him personally, but I knew men like him. The ones who passed the stories forward. The ones who made sure the truth survived even when the official record stayed sealed. Those men are as important as the ones who pull the triggers. They keep the memory alive. Rowe looked up, his eyes wet. Your father raised a son who recognized me when no one else could. A son who tried to stop an injustice when it was happening. A son who came here tonight not to ask for anything, but to apologize for something that was not his fault. Elias reached out and gripped Rowe's shoulder. That is a legacy, Sergeant Major. That is what your father built. And I promise you, he will be proud. Rowe's composure finally broke. He lowered his head, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, decades of striving to live up to an impossible standard finally finding release. Elias sat with him in silence, providing the only thing he had ever known how to give. Presence. Witness. The quiet assurance that some burdens did not have to be carried alone. When Rowe finally lifted his head, his expression had changed. The guilt was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that looked like resolution. I want to help, he said. Whatever you need, whatever General Webb is planning, I want to be part of it. Elias considered the offer. For 12 years, he had refused every hand extended toward him, but today had changed something fundamental in the way he understood his place in the world. He was not alone. He had never been alone. The threads of connection he thought he had severed were still there, waiting to be picked up again. There are other veterans like me, Elias said slowly. Men who fell through the cracks. Men who believe they do not deserve help. Men who are sleeping under bridges tonight because they cannot find their way back. He met Rose's eyes. If you want to help, help them. Find them. Reach them. Show them that someone still sees them. Rose nodded, understanding settling into his features. That is what you would have wanted. For yourself. That is what I still want, Elias said. What happened today, the recognition, the ceremony, none of that matters if it stops with me. The only way it means anything is if it opens doors for the ones still lost. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fading sunset. I spent 12 years believing I deserved nothing. And maybe I did not deserve what happened today. But they do. Every veteran sleeping on concrete tonight, wondering if anyone remembers their service, they deserve someone to come looking for them. He turned back to Roe. That is the mission now. Not me. Them. Roe rose to his feet and came to attention. He did not salute, understanding somehow that Elias would not have wanted it. Instead, he simply nodded, a soldier accepting orders from a commander worth following. Yes, Master Sergeant. I understand. Then he turned and left, closing the door quietly behind him, carrying a purpose that would shape the rest of his career. And Elias stood at the window as darkness fell, watching the first stars appear, thinking of all the men still lost in the shadows, waiting to be found. 3 months later, the guest house had become something more than a place to sleep. It had become a way station. The first veteran arrived 2 weeks after the ceremony, a former Marine named Jackson who had been living in his car for 8 months. Sergeant Major Rowe had found him at a rest stop off the interstate, recognized the 1,000-yard stare, and brought him to Webb's property with nothing more than a promise of hot food and no questions asked. Jackson stayed for 6 weeks. He left with a job at a veteran-owned construction company, an apartment lined up, and the first real hope he had felt in years. The second veteran was a woman named Torres, Army medic, 2 tours in Iraq. She had been sleeping in a shelter downtown, unable to hold a job because the nightmares would not let her sleep. Elias sat with her on the porch for 3 nights straight, saying nothing, just being present, until she finally started talking about the things she had seen. She was still staying in the guest house, working through the VA paperwork with help from a lawyer Webb had connected her with. Some mornings, Elias would find her sitting on the porch at dawn, watching the sunrise, and he would bring her coffee and sit beside her in comfortable silence. The third veteran was barely 22, a kid named Marcus, same first name as the general, who had come home from Afghanistan with a traumatic brain injury and nowhere to go. His family had given up on him. The system had failed him. He had been 3 days from disappearing entirely when Rose's network found him. Elias taught him to garden. It seemed like a small thing, but the act of putting hands in soil, of nurturing something growing, of watching life emerge from careful attention, it helped. Marcus still had bad days, but he had fewer of them now. The cottage had become a way station, and Elias had become something he never expected to be again. A shepherd, guiding lost souls back from the wilderness. On a Tuesday morning in February, Elias walked across the grounds to the main house for breakfast with Webb. The routine had become comfortable over the past months. 2 old soldiers sharing meals and memories, building something new from the wreckage of what they had lost. Webb was waiting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. We had another call last night, Webb said as Elias climbed the steps. Rose people found a veteran in Richmond. Vietnamera, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, living under an overpass for the past 4 years. Elias settled into the chair beside him. When is he coming? Tomorrow, if he agrees. Rose is with him now. Elias nodded, wrapping his hands around the coffee mug Webb handed him. The warmth seeped into his scarred fingers, chasing away the February chill. There are so many of them, Elias said quietly. More than I ever knew. Webb was silent for a moment. We cannot save all of them. No, but we can save the ones we find. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, painting the garden in shades of gold. Somewhere in the guest house, Torres was waking up. Marcus was probably already in the garden, checking on the seedlings he had planted last week. Jackson had called yesterday to say he had gotten a promotion. Small victories. Individual lives pulled back from the edge. It was not enough to fix a broken system, but it was something. It was a start. I received a letter yesterday, Webb said. From Bradford Sterling. Elias looked at him. The name had not been spoken in months. After the resignation, Sterling had disappeared from military circles entirely. Rumor said he had moved to the Midwest, away from everyone who knew what had happened. What did it say? Webb reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Elias without comment. The handwriting was neat, precise, the penmanship of a man who had spent decades writing official correspondence. But the words were different. Raw, unpolished. Master Sergeant Thorne, the letter began. I have spent 3 months trying to write this letter. I have started it 100 times and thrown away every attempt. Nothing I write seems adequate to address what I did. Elias read on. You told me that the measure of a man is not in his errors, but in what he does after. I did not understand those words when you spoke them. I was too consumed by my own humiliation, my own destroyed ambitions, to hear what you were really saying. But I hear them now. I have taken a position with a veterans outreach organization in Kansas City. It is not glamorous. It does not come with rank or prestige or any of the things I spent my career chasing. But every day, I meet men and women who served, who sacrificed, who came home broken, and who were forgotten by the country they protected. I cannot undo what I did to you. I cannot erase the cruelty or the arrogance or the blindness that led me to treat you the way I did. But I can try to become the kind of man who would never make that mistake again. You offered me grace when I deserved condemnation. I'm trying to be worthy of that grace. With respect and gratitude, Bradford Sterling. Elias folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Webb. He took the lifeline, Elias said quietly. Webb nodded. Seems like it. They sat in silence, watching the morning unfold. The garden was coming alive with early spring growth. Birds sang in the trees that lined the property. And somewhere in Kansas City, a broken man was trying to rebuild himself by helping others. I visited David's grave last week, Elias said. First time since the ceremony. Webb turned to look at him. How was it? Elias considered the question. For years, he had avoided the cemetery. The headstone beside Margaret's, the finality of seeing his son's name carved in granite, it had been too much to bear. But something had changed in the months since the parade ground. I told him about this place, Elias said. About the veterans we have helped. About what we are building here. I told him that his father finally stopped running. He paused, his voice growing rough. I told him I was sorry it took so long. And I told him I would keep going until I could not go anymore. That I would find the lost ones and bring them home, the way I should have let someone find me years ago. Webb reached over and gripped his shoulder. The same gesture he had made on the parade ground. The same unspoken understanding between men who had survived impossible things together. He would be proud of you, Webb said. Margaret, too. Elias nodded slowly. I think maybe they would. He looked out at the garden where Marcus was now visible, kneeling in the soil, tending to the seedlings with careful attention. Torres had emerged onto the guest house porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise the way she did every morning now. Lost souls finding their way back. One at a time, one day at a time. Still here, Elias whispered, the words meant for ghosts who might be listening. Still standing. And finally doing something worth standing for. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us unrecognized every day, please consider subscribing to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform anymore. They're the ones we walk past without seeing, carrying burdens we cannot imagine, waiting for someone to remember that they matter. Thank you for watching.